Record. Thank you. This is a special meeting is called for the ESInet user group with a focus on CenturyLink, Lumen, and Entrado, discussing their progress for meeting Next-Gen 911 requirements. Who from Lumen is going to take the lead for the conversation?
Hello, my name is Paul Brown, Lumen's Public Policy Director for Regulatory and Compliance on 911. I can help start the conversation up. Good morning, everyone.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning.
And I guess we're ready to go.
Yep, you can move forward and go ahead.
All right, bear with me for just a moment. Not familiar with using Zoom, so I can get this. Let me know if you all can see my screen when I start this. Are you able to see my screen?
I'm not.
Okay. Let's try. How about that?
I see it started to share, and there it is. I can see that. Thank you, Paul.
You're very welcome. Before we go much further, can we sort of take roll from Lumen? Who do we have on the call?
Tressa's here.
Hi, Tressa.
Hey.
Kevin's on.
Kevin, thanks.
Tracy's here.
I'm sorry? Oh, hi, Tracy.
Tracy Dillo, Paul, and Doug Cunningham.
Doug. Thank you, Doug. All right. Anyone else that I missed?
I'm kind of Lumen. This is Rich Johnston from Entrado.
Oh, Rich.
Hello.
Okay. We may get another person in here to talk along the lines, dig a little deeper, but I'm sure we could probably keep this high enough level where myself and Mr. Cunningham can hopefully answer any questions. The conversation today will center around Lumen as an OSP regarding this upcoming NG 911 to facilitate phase 1 and phase 2 evolution. Just some of the housekeeping. I'll be covering the proposal summary and covering the topic of valid request. Then we'll start getting into sort of the higher level, what phase 1 connectivity might look like and phase 2 connectivity. In the summary request, in the summary, I'm talking about the valid request for the 911 authority. This was issued by the FCC, that a checklist and a valid request form would be.
So sorry. I'm going to stop you and interrupt you really quickly. This is Jennifer Kirkland with the State 911 program. Did I hear you correctly that you are presenting from CenturyLink's position as an OSP? Because we thought we were here to talk to you about CenturyLink's readiness as our basic emergency service provider.
That was not what I was led to believe for today's conversation. It's not that we can't have a conversation regarding that. That does take on a bit of a different context. And that's not the way I necessarily prepared the meeting. We wanted to cover as an OSP what Lumen would be doing similar to other OSPs for the state of Colorado.
Okay. I think we're all interested to hear what you're thinking and to see your presentation, but at some point in the very near future, we will also apparently need to schedule a second meeting because we also would like to know CenturyLink and Entrado's readiness to move forward from a basic emergency service provider viewpoint.
Okay.
So please go ahead and proceed, and thanks for clarifying.
Yes, you're welcome. Just make a note real quick. Okay. Regarding wireline and interconnected VoIP providers, yes, the order covers service providers to essentially prepare their network to deliver IP services to 911. And in general, IP services will eventually move the demarcation away from where we're currently offering closer to the end office portions of our network. The FCC order requests that no later than 6 months after the effective date of a valid request is received from the 911 authority, the OSP should begin the transition. One of the items that we needed to get clarity on was who, because of Colorado's unique setup for 911, I think there's 90 plus PSAPs in the state, and each of those 90 PSAPs act as their own, excuse me, act as their own 911 authority. And to help aggregate that information to make the project go a little smoother, Lumen reached out to Jennifer Kirkland and Daryl Branson, and they agreed to act as representatives for all of the PSAPs within the state. This will help us consolidate the information and document the readiness of each of the authorities throughout the state. Does anyone have it? I'm going to stop real quick right there. Does anyone have any questions about that?
I do. Joe Benkert here.
Okay. Hello, Joe.
As I understand the FCC's order, and a 911 authority, whether talking local or statewide, can't request an OSP to start delivering traffic, either phase 1 or phase 2, until it has at least a commitment from a basic emergency service provider, SSP, at the federal level, to be able to receive and deliver the SIP and SIP with PIDFlow to the PSAP. And that's why we're interested in understanding when CenturyLink as the OSP is going to make that available. And then, as I understand the FCC report and order, once that's available, where CenturyLink has committed to provide that capability, then we can request it individually when our individual PSAPs are ready to receive SIP and PIDFlow.
Well, to some degree that's accurate, Joe, but more or less what we're looking, phase 1 is going to require the conversion away from TDM and ensure that the calls are flowing to the 911 originator, or I'm sorry, the 911 core as IP. Now, PIDFlow and the rest of that design is really geared more toward phase 2. That's why we're breaking this into two groups.
Paul, may I chime in here?
Yeah, go ahead, Doug.
So my role at Lumen is to be the solution architect for Next Gen 911 Solutions. Doug Cunningham here. Today, the entire solution for the state of Colorado is already SIP capable. It is already receiving SIP traffic 100% on ingress. The order that changes specific to Colorado will be moving that LNG function from, if required for an OSP, into their own purview. Today, the traffic, all of the traffic that we have for the state of Colorado is converted via the Lumen LNGs, and we bring that into our NextGen 911 provider, Entrado via SIP. So to start out the conversation there, the understanding, as far as meeting in-state POIs, we're available to do that, to have that conversation with whomever is deemed the appropriate personnel within the state of Colorado. Today, we offer national POIs, which exist in Islands Ranch, Colorado, and Chicago, Illinois. Those are available. We've been converting, accepting SIP traffic at those locations for several years now. In state, we have options that we've identified that we just need someone with the authority to say, yes, these will be the in state. So I know there was question in the beginning of this, not to just cut through the red tape, but I want to make sure that there's no misunderstanding here about Lumen's capability as a NextGen 911 provider, as well as with its partner Entrado to accept phase 1 compliance with the current NextGen solution for Colorado. There's further dialogue to talk about phase 2, but we definitely can have that conversation at some point as well. So all that's just not to steal any thunder there, but I just wanted to make sure that that was put out there.
Thank you, Doug. No, wasn't stealing any thunder. Appreciate
So
that.
if I can, is your understanding then that we are able then to request phase 1 from OSPs today? Because you're capable as the BESP of receiving and delivering SIP sessions to us, to our PSAPs.
So that requirement requires the, as you stated, location of the NextGen 911 designation points. And as soon as we identify those with the state to give us authority to move forward, we can help you comply and issue letters of point of interface connection points.
And
Does that
that's
make
going to be a
sense?
discussion with Jennifer and Daryl.
If that is who the deemed, I apologize. I don't work directly with Colorado, but if that's the personnel that's identified, then yes, that would be the persons.
This is Jennifer. Did you just say in that just this previous few minutes that you have 3 points of interconnection in Colorado, and that is POI into the state ESInet? Is that right?
We have 2 points. We have
The requirement of the order, Steve, is or I'm sorry, Paul, is that there are 2 within state or territory according to the order.
Yeah.
We are prepared to offer diverse connection points for the state.
But what you're saying is that the SIP traffic would be delivered to one of 2 point of interconnection into the state ESInet for distribution within the ESInet. Is that right?
My understanding is that every OSP will be required to connect to both of those. Lumen, we have national connectivity options where we're already co-located with national carriers such as your big 3 wireless providers, some of your VoIP providers. If the state chooses to allow for that connectivity point, then those connection would already be made, right? It would just be in the logical provisioning to accept traffic through there.
Okay, so I guess what I'm trying to say is that the OSPs would be interconnecting to 2 POIs into the state ESInet. So it's not that the OSPs are connecting individually to 57 governing authorities or 84 PSAPs. They're connecting to 2 points of interconnection into the ESInet.
They would not be required to do that for each individual entity or PSAP related to Colorado. Their trunk groups can be larger trunk groups, and we can use logical provisioning to set up individual default options.
Okay, So I just want to answer a question that was posed in the chat. The FCC order says that a 911 authority is a state, territorial, regional, tribal, or local government entity that operates or has administrative authority over all or any aspect of a communications network for the receipt of 911 traffic at next-gen 911 delivery points and for the transmission of such traffic from that point to the PSAP. So I read that to be in Colorado, those points of interconnection to the ESInet. And Daryl and I agreed to be the state point of contact for the ESInet. I am not, and we would not be a voice for LIDA or any other authority for that kind of purpose. So I just wanted to clarify Kimberly's question. And I'm going to put that definition that I read into the chat, which is out of the report and order, because I think it's really important to understand that key point that we just established, that a valid request would be for OSPs to connect to the ESInet and not necessarily to individual PSAPs.
That's a good call out, clarification, Jennifer.
I think there have been several clarifications, but the important point is, so you're saying CenturyLink can deliver now, we can make requests, or you're still waiting for action from the PUC, Jennifer and Darrell?
We'll be waiting for the valid request form from Jennifer and Daryl.
So each of the OSPs will require that valid request form. If like based on the chat, if
Yeah, they'll be
each
getting
county
that.
is the one that needs to make that
Right.
authorization, that just is more complexity added to the communication stream, but that's also fine and within the purview of the state. I think the prerequisite, as you identified, Joseph, was to make sure that these NG911 designation points are already listed. That is step one, or delivery points rather, not designated points. So I think that is step one of this. If we can agree that that communication is going to be the same to every 911 authority, whatever that prescribes to territorial, regional, tribal, or local, then that conversation is the same regardless, right?
Okay, and then once you get whatever you need from Jennifer and Darrell to designate that, is there any delay? Is there any work that you have to complete, or it's all ready to go?
The work is a established network that's already in place for Lumen backbone. So the work that would be required would be individual OSP alignment to offer connectivity on an individual port basis.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the whole last bit of what you said. Could you repeat that?
It's a service delivery task, right? So each OSP, if not connected already, would have individual connectivity arrangements arranged at those two locations. So there's additional tasks to follow.
Yeah, and the clarification I'm looking for is, as I read the order, is that requests cannot be made until we have either the capability for our BESP for CenturyLink as the BESP to receive and the traffic in SIP, 911 calls in SIP, and then deliver them to the PSAPs. And once you get notification from designation of the points, do you have to do anything to implement them, or you're ready to receive them as soon as you get that notification?
Once we have the agreement to proceed with these delivery points, then we will craft a OSP connection letter that can be distributed to the OSPs. And this is part of the solution that we offer to work with the OSPs to coordinate this migration. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. I'm not trying to skirt around anything, but the intent is that once those delivery points are named that it'll be published, and each individual request to each OSP will need to be made.
Okay,
So
okay,
we'll
yeah,
still
the
be looking-
prerequisite is, for us, is that those points are available where you can receive the SIP and then deliver them. And
Correct.
so we just need the designation.
Which we provide the actual address, ordering location, so that each of the OSPs can take action, as well as a contact that would be there to align to individual specific port details.
But that's just giving us the details of what's in place.
No, that's the process to order to and work with the OSPs.
Right, but the points that you're going to give us the details of where they connect to,
Correct.
those points are
Correct.
already available, capable of receiving SIP, correct?
Correct. We are available to do that today.
Okay. Great. Then all we need is to do that designation. That's wonderful. I'm sorry to kind of sidetrack this, but that's kind of what's important to us for the BESP perspective piece of it. So
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to chime in here as well, ensuring that we're trying to meet the intent of this meeting. It wasn't our intent to come in not understanding that this was supposed to be around the next gen side, not the OSP.
Well, this is Jennifer. I'm disappointed that isn't the focus of this meeting, because we have had several conversations with several different people at CenturyLink about what we wanted this meeting to be about. And that was, we wanted to hear CenturyLink and Intrado's plan and timeline for readiness to accept and move forward with valid requests to the OSPs to deliver traffic to our statewide ESInet. If I understood you correctly, I think you just said that the Lumen and Intrado are ready to accept those now. Is that right?
That is correct. It's just a conversation about identifying the delivery points.
Well, I think there's also conversation about what kind of equipment is deployed on the network statewide, and will it be compatible with SIP if there are PSAPs using legacy network gateways, and is the call handling equipment ready to accept that as well? So I'm not sure that we're ready to just submit a request tomorrow. And that was my understanding, that this conversation today was going to be centered around next steps for the statewide ESInet and what needs to happen in order to be ready to make those valid requests.
Sure. And
So,
I'm happy to
Jennifer, this
address
is-
that as well. There's not, oh, go ahead, Rich, if you'd like to.
Yeah, no, so I think we can shift and have that discussion today, Jennifer. I'll give you the high level and we can get into whatever detail you want. The high level is that the Lumen Intrado next generation core infrastructure is ready to accept SIP traffic today. And no matter
I'm sorry,
how-
Rich, could you get close to your microphone? It's so difficult to hear you, unless that's
Okay,
just
was
me.
everyone having issues with it?
Yeah, you sound far away,
Sort of
Rich.
muffled.
So just
Okay.
to add,
Oh,
while
okay.
Rich is trying to fix his mic there, the ingress capability for conversion to SIP is not impacted by anything on the egress side to the PSAP. So whether there's an LPG or you have SIP handoff, that's what the core services is doing today. It's actually integrating or interworking depending on whatever PSAP delivery mechanism is needed. That's done on the ESInet side. The ingress side is not impacted by SIP delivery. As I stated early in the call, 100% of the calls that go into the Intrado core today are already being converted with LNG. That means that we are performing what we call a PIF function. We're converting your TDM SS7 traffic in our LNGs, and we're converting that and delivering it into Intrado via SIP.
Sorry, is this better, folks?
That's much better, Rich.
It was on the wrong mic. I apologize. So yeah, sorry, just to fall through and then we can continue talking. Exactly what Doug just said. So our solution, and there's two phases of this too, right? Phase one is, I'm going to give you the basics, is basic SIP. So that's calls coming into the infrastructure with voice and ANI via IP. And the way that our system and PSEPs are set up, however we deliver it to the PSEP location, is that we can take in that basic IP, that phase one requirement, process it and deliver it to all PSEPs in Colorado today. Um, so that's a feature and function of our environment. The way we deliver to a PSEP today is generally IP, we call it RFAI. Nothing changes on that side for those PSEPs, and for those PSEPs that are still getting the call delivered CAMA, we are delivering IP all the way to that CPE location and then converting back to CAMA. So nothing changes there either. So the egress from the infrastructure out to the PSEPs doesn't have to change for phase one. We accept the call via IP and we deliver it like we do today. For phase two, that's different. We can have more discussion, and that's when we're delivering IP and PIDA flow. That requires CPE changes. That requires tariff updates to allow for I3 to go through. So there's a lot surrounding the phase two portion of that to allow, I3 end to end. But for the phase one, our infrastructure is ready to accept and does already accept IP traffic in that phase one format today.
Rich, is the tariff offering which was recent withdrawn and CenturyLink is committed to refile once the rulemaking is completed. Is that going to give us what we need from CenturyLink for phase two, or is there more required beyond that?
To be honest, I that's not my area, so I don't want to misrepresent it. And I don't know if we have those folks on this call to
Okay.
talk about the phase two.
I did
the
not
tariff.
hear Tim join from regulatory.
I haven't
Okay,
heard
he's on.
there you are. Okay. Thank you, Tim.
Tim, I'd defer to you on that. Was that latest tariff amendment, including I3 services?
It would be GIS.
So Tim, just to clarify, so the original one that was filed back in September had an I'm going to say this word gently, an option to have PSEPs go to I3. The GIS routing is not I3. GIS routing can be done outside of I3, and because of PSEP's capability and their budgeting and their CPE version and levels, I3 is a bigger undertaking. So I'm not sure what the future of I3 is. The GIS routing particularly does not have to include I3.
Yeah, I think I3 conversion, is that,
Yeah,
am I recalling correctly, is what you titled one of the services?
that was, I think, the title in the original, the tariff that was put in back in September or so. So there was like a one-time fee, I think, associated to I3 conversion.
Yeah, hey, this is Steve Lochin. To add on to what Rich said, the reason there was hesitation is because to truly deliver an end-to-end I3 call, there was some cost concerns about what would be required at the PSAP end to receive that call. So that was the reason I think that was pulled from the tariff, because of the cost concerns about upgrading all of the CPE in the state to be able to accept an I3 call.
Okay, and as I understand the FCC's order with the clarifications are that individual governing bodies can request an OSP to provide phase one or phase two, um, even if the other PSAPs in the state can't receive them, aren't capable of accepting them. And so I think it's actually like a two-stage, it sounds like with this deal where we need to have the state approve or give the designation for the OSP connection points for SIP connections. And then the actual individual authorities may have to make the requests since not, it sounds like not all not all PSAPs in the state, at least for phase two, may be able to accept them initially.
Which, Joseph, sort of brings me back to the beginning of the conversation, and that is to discuss. The meeting was to circle around discussing OSP communication by each of the 911 authorities, having that conversation to find out what they're capable of, and to start making the preparations. And I believe the order says they have 6 months to prepare themselves to deliver calls to the Ingress core network as SIP. And we would expect that the 911 authority of those individual, all 90 some odd PSAPs in Colorado, would have that conversation, and then circle that information back as a matter of logistics back over to Daryl and to Jennifer.
If I can, just before we move on, I've been kind of dominating the conversation, and there are other people in the community who also know very much about the FCC order and have attended some, I think, workshops that may have perspectives. And so if anybody else wants to address those, I don't want to, be the only one speaking before we move to what you intended to address in this meeting.
Thank you, Joe. Jackie has her hand up.
Yeah, I have a question. So we're talking about, because not all the CPEs are ready to take SIP directly. I'm assuming that means the CPEs that are on the gateways would not work with the I3 scenario. And in addition, do we have an inventory of just how many PSAPs are on those gateways and cannot take IP directly?
So let's clarify that comment, just because I think it's important.
Yeah, because I was a little confused.
Yeah, that's all right. Just because a PSAP is accepting or can accept IP doesn't mean it can accept I3. So there's additional configurations, possible code updates, things of that nature on the CPE side to go from what we're doing in Colorado, which is a transitional IP solution, to I3. So so there's kind of three situations, I would say. PSAPs that are currently taking the call in CAMA, right? And for those PSAPs in Colorado today, Lumen and Intrado are putting media converters at the PSAP location to take because we are sending it IP to the PSAP, we're converting it to CAMA and then handing it off to the CPE via CAMA. The second situation is, some folks may have heard the term RFAI. That's the transitional IP solution. So for those PSAPs, the majority of PSAPs in Colorado that are accepting IP, that's what we're doing today. We're sending the call in a basic IP fashion, which sends it in voice, sends the ANI, and that is taken in directly by the CPE without any conversion. This third situation is I3. So I3 requires CPE changes and updates and configurations, and also will require changes, configurations, update within the core infrastructure itself. But aside from all that, we'll have to have an avenue to do that, which is tariff, to allow us to enable I3 on the infrastructure. So when we get to I3, which is that phase 2 of the FCC order, a lot of things have to be taken into consideration before we go that far, not only tariffs, but configurations on the ESInet as well as configurations of the PSAP. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Hey, and this is Steve. So, Rich, I just want to add one other thing is today in the state of Colorado, all of the calls are being delivered via the ESInet as IP, and to Rich's point, being converted to analog at the customer prim. So throughout the Lumen ESInet, the call is being delivered at the PSAP via IP.
There are different CPE providers providing CPE to PSAPs in the state. Is it your understanding that none of the CPE systems provided to PSAPs in the state are currently capable of accepting I3? And is that more than just PITFlow?
So this is the way I would state that. I'm sure, absolutely sure, there are CPEs that are deployed in Colorado that are capable of I3. I'm also sure that there are some that probably aren't. Saying that, to convert from IP to I3 will require configuration changes on those CPEs that are capable. So, which means anytime you're talking about configuration changes, you're talking about testing, turnup, resources, and costs. So my guess is that the majority of the CPE out there can accept I3 now with their current code base because I3 has been around long enough now that if they've had an update to their CPE equipment in the last 5 years or so, they probably can. But just because they can doesn't mean there aren't considerable configurations, resources, time, and effort to do so.
As well as cost, because what we do and have seen in the past is although your backroom equipment may be next gen ready, it may require some firewalls or SBCs depending upon your CPE provider. And then, as Rich said, calls for configuration and testing. Because what we've seen in the past is when PSAPs opted to do a hardware refresh, they may or may not have included to make their equipment next gen CPE ready. They may have made it next gen compliant, but not next gen CPE ready, which would have required a significant investment or an investment in firewalls and SBCs and prepaying for some services that they may not need from the vendor for several years. So most opted not to include the CPE for the equipment to be next gen compliant, but just chose to make sure the software on the host was next gen 911 ready.
So as
Yeah,
I understand the order, in order for a PSAP to make a request for phase 1 or phase 2, it has to, it doesn't have to have its CPE ready and network ready. It has to have commitments from its next gen 911 core services provider, or in this case would be the BESP, which includes that, and its CPE provider, a commitment from them to implement the changes necessary to receive the SIP or PITFlow within the 6-month compliance period. And I think it would be 12, or it could be longer for the phase 2. And so we may need to get commitments from our CPE vendors, but would we also need to get commitments from CenturyLink as to any changes in the network in order for the PITFlow, the I3?
I would say that that's just a contractual add to the tariff, right? It's just a service add. And I think what's the important message in this whole conversation is around the core compliance, enable the ability to support it in any fashion, right? When I say any fashion, 3 of the fashions that Rich laid out before. The core is capable of doing that today. It's really an enablement and having the ability to add that services to the tariff.
Okay.
I want to jump in here. We've got some questions in the chat, and the one that's related to this conversation, and then we'll get to Tracy, to yours. Kimberly asked if Rich could give us some examples. I know there's a lot of PSAPs and authorities on this call that use Intrado. Rich, can you address the question that Kimberly had in the chat?
Sure. And let me say this, I am not a CPE expert. My side of the house is Next Generation Core Services and ESInet. So I don't know off the top of my head exactly which versions of Viper or Motorola or Solacom or whatever are accept i3, and different iterations have accepted i3. So what I think the proper path there is I could go try to reach out from Intrados to Intrados, but I think the proper course there is for the PSAP to reach out to whoever's providing their CPE solutions and ask that question, because it could be different depending on the code release and what any patches they're on and all that stuff. Again, I'm sorry, I'm just not super comfortable with that side of it.
Yeah. Hey, I'll take that one. This is Steve. So what we do know, and we've deployed throughout the country, is that Vesta 7.0 or 7.x is i3 compliant from a software perspective. And we know Viper 7 is compliant from a software perspective. So what I would say is, if I'm doing an inventory of the PSAPs, if they have Viper 7 or Vesta 7, from a software and baseline hardware, it would require some upgrades from they may need to go to Service Pack 1, 2, or 3 on the Intrado side. And on the Vesta side, it could be Vesta 7.3, but they're in that 7 family. Then I think from a hardware perspective, the system is next gen 911 ready, and then you've got to add any configuration and firewalls and SBCs in order to actually receive an i3 call. And I say that with confidence because we've deployed it in other states on the Viper 7 and the Vesta 7 platform.
Hey, Steve, I would say for the CPE here, because there is a, conversation with integration to the core that Rich was mentioning there, I would say we probably should defer to that list just to prevent any confusion, because there are some certain aspects to each CPE that are specific in what has been tested.
Yeah, I'm just saying in general, with Intrado, we know Vesta 7 and Viper 7, the bot room hardware is compliant. So there may be some, software revision updates that need to be made of some hardware, but we have it working and integrated with the Lumen A911 ESInet on Vesta and Viper 7 and above.
Okay.
Does that answer your question? Perfect. Thank you.
Can we going back? There's some hands or some questions more in the chat. Just following up, and Tracy, I'll get back to you on your POI question. Looks like Jennifer's asking, can we have specific language, and maybe somebody from Lumen can put it in the chat, for those that are needing to reach out to their CP provider for what we need to ask in order to determine the answer for compliance?
Yeah.
Can you do that?
Yeah, we'll send something out, but I think it's really straightforward, because all of the CPE vendors are designing and building their code to the NENA i3 standards. I think the only thing that needs to be asked of your CPE provider is saying, hey, you're on the Lumen Intrado A911 network, and you want to be able to receive an i3 call. And I think they can take, and I can send that in an email, they can take that information and determine what you need on your CPE to be able to receive that call. And if they have any questions, they can always reach out to me or Kevin Newton or Doug to get clarification.
Yeah, we'll put together language for you. I think it's
Yeah.
just to reiterate, Steve, I think the question is, can you provide a quote for readiness on the Lumen Entrado A911 ESInet
Yeah.
infrastructure utilizing I3?
And we can do that. Absolutely.
Okay, so you guys will put together language. You can send it to Jennifer and I. We'll distribute it to the EUG, and not just quote. I think people are looking for requirements and the technical language, so those that don't speak at the high level that you guys have been presenting at, they can take basic information and be able to get the answers that they need for their PSAP.
Yeah, we'll take care of that. And I just want to clarify. So can't give you a quote on the CPE for the other vendors, but I think Rich is saying there is some work required on the next gen core services side in order to be able to deliver I3. Can definitely do that because we are the BSP, but we can provide you. Go ahead.
Sorry, Steve, that's not what I'm saying. So in some cases, Lumen is the CPE provider of record. In some cases, they're not. So what we're talking about is generalized language that the PSEPs can send to whoever their CPE provider is to ask for I3 readiness.
And I said earlier, we can take care of that. That's not a problem.
For the areas that Lumen is providing CPE solutions, right? My guess is, Steve, that Lumen isn't providing CPE solutions for every PSEP in the state.
Absolutely.
Correct?
What we're going to do, we're going to send out a document that basically shows what the requirements are for the CPE to interface with our A911 ESInet. And then whatever that CPE vendor says is needed, based on that, they can provide a quote for that CPE portion. Yeah, we'll take care of that. Not a problem.
Okay, let's have this conversation offline. I'm not sure if that's the right way to do it. I think the PSEPs just need to ask the readiness to interconnect I3 with the Entrado Lumen infrastructure. Because
we'll give them the language they need to put in there, Rich. So we're all on the same page there.
Okay, so Rich and Steve, you guys are going to talk offline to figure out, and can you get that to us by 1 week from today?
Absolutely, not a problem.
Okay, thank you. All right, going back in the chat, we've still got some questions. Kimberly, did that answer what you were seeking? And then I want to go back to Tracy's.
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Okay, and Tracy had a question about, can you back in the chat, can you clarify the contemplated POIs in Colorado? And then she put the definition that's in Lumen's annual contingency plan, if you want to reference that in the chat.
So I'll speak in a generality to it, right? What would be listed in the existing plan today would relate to TDM delivery, which means that we're accepting T1s or DSOs from the smaller LECs at our POI locations, which have constraints around LATA boundaries, I believe. Being that IP does not fit into those same LATA arrangements, it would need to be adjusted for the SIP delivery. So in relation to any plans that would be put out there for contingency plans, those would have to be updated to include the POIs during a transitional period or at the time of their decommission be removed from the plan. Hopefully that addresses your issue there.
So this is, I have a question. When a request is made of an OSP and they begin delivering traffic to that POI, is that traffic going to be delivered to the entire state in that format, or would it be delivered to the individual PSAP or 911 authority in that format?
We would prefer to, once cut over via that OSP, to have everything from that OSP coming in through that particular path But obviously there's a migration plan and everything would need to be worked with that individual OSP to understand each individual OSP's impact on which counties they are actually supporting today.
And Doug,
Right.
can I expand on that a little bit?
Sure,
too?
Rich.
Okay. So in the case that, let's say, carrier A sends in all traffic for the entire state on those redundant diverse IP paths. There is, and I want to clarify this for the phase one approach, there is a way to distinguish per call what a default route is as well. And Doug, you can keep me honest here, but there are configurations that when and I'm just trying to ask or answer the future questions that are coming on this. So when a carrier sends a call for Boulder, they'll send in essence, a default number with that call, that in case there is a problem with that call, that it knows how to default route. So just because you're using shared connections for the entire state doesn't mean that we can't default route on a per PSEP level. So that those configurations, those specifications and protocols are set up with the carriers coming into his IP, so we don't lose that kind of PSEP level default routing capability. Sound good, Doug, to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's important there is we have 3 published interface specs for Ingress that are supporting different OSPs today that allow for things such as ESRN or RDN. So depending on the capability of that end office, as well as using things like TGRP. So uh, what's important there, I think, Rich, is you're just trying to identify, like, if we support larger trunk groups, there's still a way to identify, smaller default options for those each individual trunks, so that it can support in the similar fashion of what you're doing today.
Absolutely. So, and to go back to a discussion we had a little bit earlier, would these or these IP trunks ever go directly into a PSEP? The answer is no there, because if you were to have a carrier set of IP trunks directly to a PSEP, that then avoids or that goes around the whole intelligent infrastructure here. We have to have the carriers come into the infrastructure, and it makes a heck of a lot of more sense for carriers to establish larger redundant diverse trunk groups into the infrastructure to handle multiple PSEPs than it does individual IP trunk groups into the infrastructure for each individual PSEP.
So what you're saying, Rich, is that none of us can request phase one compliance from any OSP until all of us are ready for it. Is that an accurate summarization?
No, I don't think that's true, because no, that's not true. Those carriers that establish those trunk groups can establish them understanding that there are going to be future PSEPs coming onto the infrastructure. So they would just, if one piece, once the POIs are identified and that request for service is made, if Boulder goes first, they're free to do that. And then if Longmont comes in after, then those OSPs would be expected just to add those calls on those. They should they should architect their solution understanding that more PSEPs would come on. And then once Longmont was ready, they would just add that call traffic to those existing redundant diverse trunk groups into the Lumen infrastructure.
Just a quick follow up on that, if you wouldn't mind. What is the perceived, I guess, issue with having Ingress coming in via SS7 TDM or SIP today, right? Whether that's where one county does it and another doesn't want to. Is there a perception that there's a huge impact to differences to that individual PSAP?
I think what I would like clarity on, and I still don't have clarity on, is, I'm going to ask this question in 2 parts.
Okay.
One, addressing the phase 1 request, just the phase 1 request. What I would like to have clarity on what CenturyLink needs in order to effectively implement phase one request? Do you need it from each individual PSAP, or do you need it from a statewide level just for phase one? And if I understand right, phase one is call delivery in SIP format. Then the next step of the question is, if based on the conversation that we've had, it sounds to me like phase one is not as much of a big deal, but if we were going to move to phase two absolutely needs to happen at a statewide level rather than an individual authority or PSAP level. So I guess the question that I'm asking is, what does CenturyLink need the process to be for phase one requests?
Mhm.
And what is the process to move to phase two?
As a BESP.
Yeah, part
From the
one
BESP.
is the next gen 911 provider, right? It is to just work with someone within the state to have the authority to list the two uh, next gen 911 designated points, right? Delivery points. And then from there, the second part of that, and then what is the benefit of that, right? So today, the way that the TDM conversion is working, that the LNG is owned as a function of the next gen network, where that moves to the individual OSP level. So that gives you more failure domains. What does that mean? Well, the impact of one provider's connection only impacts that provider's connection, right? So it gives you improved reliability, resiliency, because you're creating more failure domains on an individual OSP level. So hopefully that part of that question is answered. We just really need to work with someone to identify that these are the correct points that can be published, so that we can move forward with phase one.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump in real quick because we only have 2 minutes left of our scheduled time. And we had Daryl had his hand up, and Joe, you also have your hand up. And then we need to figure out our next steps are. Daryl,
Joe was first. Joe, go ahead.
Are we limited to an hour, or can folks stay on later, especially the CenturyLink folks?
I think there's a need to schedule a part 2 of this meeting, since we didn't start off on the right foot to begin with the content. And there sounds we need to get some things in writing that we already asked for. And I think Jennifer's question that was just answered, verbally, would be great to get, because that's the core of what we're trying to get at here. So
well, very quickly, my question was the discussion regarding CPE readiness. As I understand, I want to confirm that only applies to phase two.
Correct.
Thank you.
a quick question from Delta County in the chat from Chris. Will these delivery points be geographically diverse, with one on the east slope and one on the west? And who decides it?
Hey, this is Steve. I'll take that one. So, as Doug mentioned earlier, that truly becomes a conversation with Lumen and the state representatives. So we can design it, based on input from you all. Right now, we do have 2 IP POAs already stood up. And if we want to have POAs deployed in the state of Colorado, then, we would work with you all and our team to figure out what's the best geographical location for those POAs. And I do know Paul Brown has, Jennifer, I don't know if your question was, how do you go about requesting phase one to get started? Paul Brown on his call has some documentation that kind of provides what needs to be done to request phase one, and we can provide that documentation as well. But I think the key takeaway is those POA locations, we can sit down, have a discussion, and determine, based on what Lumen has assets, what's the best and the most geographically diverse location to install those POAs. And what we have seen from customers that have asked for this is they may have requested one port be in the state, one be out of state, or, you know, we've not seen them want both ports in state because you could create, you know, some type of opportunity for failure. So we can work with the state to determine where those IP ports need to be located.
All right, it is 10 o'clock. I want to respect everybody's time. We need a part 2 to this. So how does it sound if first of all, can I get a contact from Lumen? Who can be our point of contact? I'll link arms with Jennifer, and so we can at least set some expectations of what we want to start the next meeting with, since we started off on the kind of the wrong path on the OSP side versus the BESP. Who from Lumen can we work directly with?
This is Paul Brown, and I would add that first off, you can reach out to me, but secondly, I would add that we need to consider the complexities of that I still don't hear answered from the 911 authorities or the individual PSAPs, and that is their engagement with the other LECs, other OSPs within the state, if they're prepared to have those conversations. So I'd like to get some clarity on that. The technical pieces of it, we get into beyond phase 1, we start getting into phase 2. Lumen is prepared, working with Entrado, Lumen is prepared to go ahead and address those measures too.
And let me say this from a contact perspective. You all can use me or Tim Conkerman. This is Steve Deloach as that point of contact, and we'll make sure the right people get engaged when needed.
Okay, I'll use Steve and Tim.
That'd be fine.
For that, sounds good. Jennifer, I'll holler at you offline, and we can put our heads together to get some specifics of what we need Lumen and Entrado to come back with. Rich, can you be our Entrado contact?
Yep.
Okay. And how does 2 weeks from today, same time, work? And then a week from today, we'll get the document that we asked for, and then we'll be able to strategize and get some information back for content for our part 2 of this conversation. Anybody have any opposition to 2 weeks from today? That would be the 4th of June. And I picked that date because the following week is our standing ESInet user group meeting that we can continue if we need to at a higher level.
Can we get Daryl's comment or a question before we get off? But
yeah, thank you, Joe. I appreciate that.
911 group meetings on the 4th, so that is okay for me.
Thanks, Joe, for that reminder. Daryl, what did you have?
Yeah, this is Daryl. I think I'm going to hold it for the next meeting. I'd like to have a conversation with CenturyLink between now and the 4th to work out some of this, because this is not. It sounds more complicated than what I understood the FCC order to require. This is just about the ingress. It's not about the egress, meaning the PSAPs don't necessarily have to get rid of their legacy PSAP gateways yet. So let's have a conversation, but I think, and first of all, I apologize for being late. I had to make a presentation at the Commissioners' Weekly meeting this morning, but I think we need more conversation on this.
Daryl, I would agree. I'd like to be able to touch base with you for better alignment on the discussion points.
Thank you.
Okay, there's some comments in the chat about needing some more preparation time. The 18th was suggested, gives us a little bit more time to have these conversations and a little more preparation. Does the 18th work? Any issues? First from Lumen.
I'm going to be out of town starting on the 15th. I don't know how important it is for me to be here, so that may not matter.
I see Jennifer suggesting that the next date be chosen at the next ESInet users group meeting, which I think is a good idea.
That works. Well, we may have more players there too, because it's a standing meeting. Okay, we'll do that. Thank you. Thank everybody for your time. We're 5 minutes over. We will continue the logistical conversation at the next EUG meeting in a couple of weeks, and we'll set a date for part 2 of this conversation and work towards getting more clarity so we can have better content from Lumen and CenturyLink, and they can be better prepared. Any last thoughts? Comments, questions?
Good initial exploratory discussion. Thank you to all.
Yeah, I echo that. Thanks, Matt. All right, everybody, have a wonderful Wednesday. We will see you at the EUG meeting in a couple weeks.
Thanks.